Hi everybody, it's Cole from Cole's Quilts, and we have more Baby Dragon quilt blocks. Sorry it's been a minute, but I've completed all of the blocks except 2 rows, so we have a lot more blocks here. Like I said before in another video, I haven't made any more videos showing me how to make the blocks because I feel like at this point you guys have the information that you need to put the blocks together. But I do want to mention a few things that might be challenges that you're coming across about this specifically. The first thing that I want to mention is that the type of quilts that I like to design have a lot of areas where you have a lot of seams coming into one place. And so you might notice that it can get really bulky. For example, if we look at this one, so this is part of the dragon wings, you see how many seams you have there. When it comes to ironing seams, there are going to be people that say you should iron them to the side. There are going to be people who say you should iron them open. There are people who say you should iron them to the dark side. I feel like for the type of quilts that I do, I don't have one way that I do it, and that's because, first of all, when they say, oh, you should iron it to the dark side, often there are so many different colors in an area that I'm ironing that that's not necessarily even clear. But secondly, ironing them to the side, in some cases, will just make it too bulky. This one is an example. With all these seams I have here, I've ironed it open. Now, ironing it open does make it not as strong as if you iron it to the side. But for me, with the number of seams that I have here, if I ironed that to the side, that's gonna make this very hard to quilt through, even with my long arm. So, like, depending on how you're quilting it, if you were trying to, like, quilting with a walking foot or free motion on your domestic, that's gonna be difficult. But even with a long arm, when I see that kind of bulk, I'm like, ooh, that's gonna be challenging. Okay, just realized I'm holding it upside down. That's how I feel about ironing those sections. The other thing that I wanna mention is that if you're newer to foundation paper piecing, and this does happen in other quilts, but I feel like specifically in the type of quilts that I make, this can be a challenge. One thing that I noticed that I want to point out, because I never, by the way, ever claimed to be very good or perfect at quilt piecing. I feel like my talent is in the design, and I like to put the quilts together, but I'm not good at like matching things up. It can be very challenging. So I want to point out something that I noticed that's already a challenge for me with the sections that I've done so far. It's kind of hard to see. What I want to try to show you is the fact that the more pieces you have that you're sewing together, the harder it is for something to be accurate. When it comes to sewing together seams, if I match sewing together 2 pieces of a block and I leave maybe a little bit extra space between the edge of the paper and the stitching, that little bit of extra space in every block, when putting together a lot of blocks with small pieces, can make those blocks slightly larger than other blocks. So I noticed that the area where I have a lot of stuff going on versus that top one, when I tried to line them up, I noticed that if I lined up the first 2, that these next 2 are a little off. And this next one is a little off, and this is a little off. Do you see? So basically what happened is that my second 2 rows are slightly bigger than my first 2 rows because it's more complex. If this happens to you, you can try to go in and look and see where your stitching is and how close it is to the paper, and sometimes you can stitch a little bit closer, or you can just try to get it as close as you can, you know. You might want to go in and bring in a little bit on the seams between the blocks. What I have found is that if it doesn't line up exactly, most people don't even notice, right? It's like a Monet. It's like you got a whole bunch of dots of paint and then you step back and you see the photo. So I wouldn't worry too much about it, but I do think that that's something to think about when you're putting it together, that you really do need to pay attention to how close the needle is to the paper. You shouldn't be sewing, when you're sewing together sections of the block, you shouldn't be sewing into the paper, but you do want the needle as close to the paper as possible without sewing through the paper. If you've noticed that you're sewing through the paper on one side and you're like 1/4 of an inch away from the paper on the other side, I would tear it out and resew it. But if it's just a little bit off, I would leave it. These are the blocks that are being added. They will be up on the website and you've noticed that I've been putting them as videos, so this will be video 7. Here's where we are so far. We have 2 sections left and then we'll be done. I think when I finish those 2 sections, I might just post it right away without a video. We'll see. One other thing that I want to say is, like I've said before, one of the challenging things about creating something from scratch like this is that there's no real way for me to predict how much fabric it's going to take. I'm pretty good at estimating somewhat closely because of my quilting experience, but it's not perfect. So there have already been multiple times throughout this process that I've had to go in and change the directions when I realized that I needed to order more of fabric. So please keep checking the directions, because there are a few of the fabrics that are used for the bigger parts. You will need more than a fat quarter, like the silver on the edges and the colors of the actual dragon. So I'm trying to keep it updated, but also if you realize that what you're using is different than what I've listed on the directions, please let me know so that I can update the directions. Happy quilting.